The house was a little chilly. Sans had left the front door wide open when he'd come outside. Not that it really mattered. The cold didn't do them any harm, and wasn't even that bothersome. They just preferred warmth when they had the choice. Both bedroom doors had been left open as well, and although he couldn't see from the living room, Papyrus expected the doors to the bathroom and the closets were open too. Sans mumbled something about starting coffee and retreated to the kitchen, leaving Papyrus standing amongst the pieces of his kit he'd left strewn across the floor. He was getting as messy as Sans. As he gathered his armor, Papyrus frowned at the small spots of rust that were already forming on the metal. Right. He'd probably been covered with snow, and he certainly hadn't taken the time to dry it off when they'd gotten home. Best to clean it up now, before it got any worse. He piled his armor up by the couch and went to the shed to hunt down supplies. He was halfway across the yard when he heard the door open behind him. He turned, and Sans skidded to a halt in the snow. Papyrus frowned. "I'm just grabbing a few things," he said.
"Right,"
Sans said, rubbing the back of his neck, sheepish.
"I knew that."
The lights in his eye sockets were constricted to sharp pinpricks. Where did Sans think he was going to go? He was a bundle of nerves this morning. Which was understandable, but it was still out of character and Papyrus didn't like it. "Since you're out here, you can help me carry things," Papyrus said, continuing on to the shed. Telling Sans to go back inside felt cruel somehow. Despite its size, the shed didn't store much. Most of the space had been converted into a sort of holding area, just in case a human happened. Better safe than sorry, though Sans liked to give him lip about the width of the bars. Lumber wasn't cheap. Besides, humans were probably pretty big to go along with being so dangerous. It was better than nothing. He'd even gone the extra mile and added a thick layer of clean, dry straw and a dog bed, reasoning that any human he managed to catch would be less likely to try escaping if it felt like it was being treated with some measure of hospitality. A little kindness never hurt. The small space outside the makeshift cell held everything Papyrus used to maintain his puzzles. He grabbed anything he thought he could use now, handing it off to Sans. Polishing rags, steel wool, a rasp, and a machine oil to use in lieu of armor polish. That would do well enough. The coffee was ready when they got back inside. Sans brought a mug over. "Thanks." Papyrus had totally forgotten about the coffee already, even though he'd smelt it as soon as they were through the door. He set the mug down at his side. He was fixated on getting his armor clean, sitting cross-legged on the floor and scrubbing at the gauntlet in his lap. Sans shrugged.
"No prob. I know how you get when there's a mess."
He stood there for a moment, then knelt down on Papyrus's bad side.
"Man, I clocked you worse than I thought."
Papyrus flinched when Sans prodded his face. It hurt like blazes, even though Sans had barely touched him. He hissed under his breath. Sans snatched his hand back like he'd burnt it.
"Sorry."
"It's okay. It's just tender, that's all." Papyrus smiled, and immediately regretted it. Everything from the shoulders up was throbbing. Sans frowned.
"It's starting to bruise. You want me to try and heal it a little?"
Sans's healing magic was the one area where he fell short of Papyrus, for whatever reason. It might have had something to do with his own poor health. "No, you're still tired," Papyrus said. "It's fine. I can heal it myself later." Talking hurt. He hoped his clipped answers weren't coming off as irritated or mad. He just really wanted to keep his face still as much as possible. Sans nodded, but then something seemed to catch his eye.
"What's that?"
He laid a hand on Papyrus's skull and tipped his head to the side.
Did I do that?
With his face turned away, Papyrus couldn't see what Sans was looking at, but there weren't many possible guesses. "It's fine," he said. "Ow."
No, it's not fine.
Sans leaned in closer, peering at Papyrus's jaw joint.
It popped out, didn't it? Why didn't you say anything?
"Well, it's back in now." Everything hurt. Talking hurt. Having his head twisted like this hurt. Every point of contact between his brother's hand and his head hurt. A lot. If Flowey's healing magic was an avalanche, Sans's was a melting icicle. He tried to heal Papyrus anyway, fingers pressed to his jaw. It hurt. And a slow drip of magic itching at the damaged bones. They could sit here all day and all they'd accomplish would be draining Sans further, along with making Papyrus's headache worse. "Sans," he said, "you really don't need to do that. I'll be fine tomorrow."
I can't just leave it like that.
Papyrus swatted Sans's hands away. It just hurt too much to put up with. "Well, you can't fix it either, so at least stop manhandling me." Sans withdrew, in every sense of the word.
I'm sorry.
He moved to stand. Papyrus stopped him, reaching out to grab his sleeve. "I didn't mean to say it like that," he said, staring down at the rusty armor in his lap. I'm just tired."
Me too.
He watched Papyrus work in silence for a few minutes, then took up a piece of steel wool and a piece of armor from the pile and started cleaning alongside him. They didn't look at each other, or speak. Papyrus, for his part, was too afraid of saying the wrong thing again to risk it. Slowly, the silence grew more companionable and less tense. Less tense. Everything that Sans had cleaned still had traces of rust left on it, but Papyrus said nothing and simply rubbed the machine oil over each piece, polishing it as best he could. He could clean it properly later. Going over the metal again right in front of his brother wasn't worth it to get rid of a few missed flecks of rust. When his armor had been seen to, Papyrus glanced up at the clock and sighed. "I should get cleaned up." He was still wearing yesterday's clothes, and he was sure he had snow melt and dirt ground into his joints. Sans nodded. He'd been buffing the same piece of armor for the last 10 minutes, and didn't stop when Papyrus stood up. Papyrus left him to his thoughts. Any comment he made would come out wrong. The sight that greeted him in the bathroom mirror was alarming enough that Papyrus actually flinched back from his own reflection. The side of his face, from temple to chin, was glossy and discolored. Sans's blue attack had scorched him when he'd run into it. Tiny craze lines spiderwebbed across the injured bones, the skeletal analogue of a bad bruise. As he undressed, Papyrus found more microfractures, and more scorch marks all along that side of his body. His armor had helped, but he couldn't cancel out the effects of the magic entirely. No wonder he was so sore. Well, Sans already felt bad enough about damaging his face. He didn't need to know about the rest. Papyrus could deal with it for one day. His jaw joint was the worst of it. The cracks were more pronounced there, and the bone darker and inflamed. It still didn't look as bad as it felt, but he had to admit it looked pretty crappy. That wasn't Sans's fault at all, and it pained him that he couldn't say so. Showering was an act of willpower for the first few minutes, with Papyrus angling the injured side of his body away from the spray, because even the water was painful. He had to get the grime out of his injuries, though. So even though each droplet felt like an ice pick jamming into his bones, he turned to face it head on. It took a few more minutes of psyching himself up to actually start scrubbing. As far as showers went, it wasn't very relaxing. At least the warmth was nice. Sans was on the phone when Papyrus came out of the bathroom. His reaction alone gave away who he'd been talking to.
"Oh, gotta go,"
Sans said hurriedly, forcing a chuckle to drown out the yelling coming over the receiver. Undyne.
"Talk to you later. Bye!"
He grinned too wide.
"Hey, bro. All squeaky clean?"
Papyrus was not going to start a fight while he was in a towel. He still had some pride. Once he was dressed, all bets were off. As much as he hated to make waves today, Papyrus was deeply uncomfortable with Sans and Undyne talking about him behind his back. That needed to stop. He came downstairs to find Sans stacking his armor neatly beside the sock/sticky note mess. The opening salvo of the argument Papyrus was preparing scattered in his head. "What are you doing?" Sans looked up, a guilty grimace on his face.
"Just straightening up," he said.
"Well, you don't need to worry about that. I'll have to leave soon anyway."
Papyrus arched a brow. Leave it to Sans to clean only when it was pointless. And meanwhile, that sock remained untouched. Papyrus hadn't cared one way or the other about Sans' discarded sock in weeks, but it was a safe, normal target for what he was feeling now. He took a few seconds to be mad about it, just for familiarity's sake.
Actually,"
Sans said, rubbing the back of his neck.
"I already called Undyne and told her you couldn't work today."
What? So that's what the call had been about. Papyrus counted backwards from 10 in his head. He was not going to snap again. He was better than that. Why? Sans blinked.
Because you're hurt? And because you're less than 12 hours out from a nuclear meltdown?"
"That's ridiculous,"
Papyrus said, adjusting his shirt sleeves where a sliver of darkened bone was peeking out.
"I'm perfectly fine."
"Yeah, saying it 20 million times doesn't make it true."
Sans crossed his arms, glaring and doing his best to loom despite being considerably shorter than Papyrus. It was a posture Papyrus often employed when Sans was being particularly lethargic. He did not appreciate having it used against him.
"I think I can judge for myself, thank you."
He preferred it when Sans just worried in the background. Now Undyne would wonder what was going on. Sans scoffed.
"Doesn't look that way from where I'm standing. Besides," he said, "it's too late. Undyne thought a day off was a great idea, so you're staying home whether you like it or not. Sulk all you want."
"I'm not sulking,"
Papyrus snapped.
"I'm annoyed."
He crossed his arms too. If it was a loom-off, he was going to win. He was more naturally inclined to loom, and he was far more practiced than his brother.
"Just where do you get off making that decision for me anyway, without even talking to me first?"
"Bro!"
Sans waved his arms, as though what he just heard was so nonsensical that he'd burst if he didn't move.
"You do the same thing to me all the time."
"I do not."
"You literally do, though. What about the library thing?"
Ah, that was technically a good point. Possibly. Papyrus may or may not have volunteered Sans to read to the younger children in town every Saturday morning. Possibly without letting Sans know about the arrangement until the last minute. But Sans was good with kids, and he was the perfect person for the job. He did all the voices when he read and everything.
You love the library thing.
Or at least, he'd never complained about it in an obvious way. Sans dragged one hand down his face.
Yeah, but you didn't ask me. You just railroaded me into it like you always do.
Okay, Papyrus said. I concede that one time I may have overstepped.
Maybe. He wasn't sorry though. It was good for Sans to get out into the community.
And the sentry job.
Papyrus barked.
I didn't make you take that job.
Since when was Sans upset about his job? Having something useful to contribute was important. Sans shook his head.
No, you nagged at me until I gave up and accepted it.
I don't nag,
Papyrus said. But even he couldn't put up much conviction behind it.
You...
This was so hard to put into words.
You don't do anything, he said. And sometimes you just need to get up and do something. And you won't if I don't push you.
That sounded a little stupid out loud. Why on earth had it taken him so long to figure out what was going on? Why had he never simply asked?
I know, bro.
Sans looked nearly relieved.
And you never stop doing things,
he said.
Sometimes you need to. I'm trying to help. You get that, right?
Papyrus opened his mouth to retort, but shut it again. He was very tired of fighting, despite how angry he was. He was very tired in general, and maybe Sans was right. He was still upset that he hadn't been given a choice in all this, but then again, perhaps it was only fair. In any case, putting up too much resistance now wasn't going to benefit him. Papyrus needed to pick his battles, conserve his energy. Maybe, if he gave in now, Sans would relax and back off a bit.
Maybe,
he sighed, scarcely believing the words coming from his own mouth.
Maybe I'll just go back to bed then.
Sans smiled, tension easing out of his face.
I think that sounds like a great idea, bro.
Papyrus really did try to sleep. He'd never been a nap person. Even though he knew he wasn't rested, he couldn't convince himself to not be awake. Sans made it look so easy. All he had to do was stop moving near something stable enough to lean on. Papyrus had been staring up at the same small crack in the ceiling for nearly an hour. He ached all over. He couldn't stop thinking. The last 12 hours had been so full his head couldn't hold it all. He'd nearly killed his brother. He couldn't control his magic in any meaningful way anymore. He wasn't safe to be around. It was even odds that he'd go off again the next time he got too stressed, too scared, too angry. Why was he so angry? It wasn't a normal anger. It didn't even seem to have a cause he could pick out. It was like every drop of fear and anxiety and misery changed as soon as he started to feel safe again, turned into something he had to hold down so it didn't hurt anyone. Like magic. It was exhausting. It was like cracking apart from the inside and trying to glue himself back together at the same time. All the time. And every day, it kept getting worse. He hadn't even felt his magic knitting together last night. He hadn't consciously constructed an attack when he'd struck Sans. He'd hit him. He could hardly wrap his mind around it. Because why in the world would he? Whatever it had been, Sans had been terrified, and with good reason. The attack could have torn free in a second. And that would have been all. He'd nearly killed Sans. He'd nearly killed Sans. He'd nearly killed his brother. And it could happen again, any time. In the face of that knowledge, Flowey's revelation this morning felt like a trifling matter. It wasn't. It was just hard for Papyrus to care about two such disparate things at once. Flowey, what he was, what and who he had once been, was an abstract concept more than it was anything comprehensible. Papyrus had to try, though. Somewhere in that story was a clue that could help him out of this mess, he was sure. The computer bleeped. Papyrus jumped and took a moment to smooth down his magic. It bristled outward along each finger, up his spine, too ready. The computer bleeped again, and Papyrus recognized the tone as an Undernet alert. He hadn't checked his messages in weeks. He didn't particularly want to check these new ones, but it was possible that they were from Undyne, and it wouldn't be a good idea to ignore her. He shouldn't have left the computer on so long. He'd forgotten all about it. It took a couple good thumps to get the monitor back up and running. One of these days, he'd have to look for a replacement. For now, he squinted at the somewhat distorted display. He had a lot of unread messages, though they started to taper off after the first couple weeks. He left them. They weren't relevant anymore, and he didn't have the energy to deal with them. Today's messages were from Alphys, not Undyne. In fact, every one of the handful of messages from the last week or so had been from Alphys. Papyrus started with the oldest ones from the beginning of the week.
OMG! MTT trying to make pasta primavera and cooking with a killer robot tonight. Know who's gonna be all over that, lol?
At Cool Skeleton 95. Smiling emoji.
Are you okay? Sorry if I'm being too creepy, but you haven't been on in a long time, so I just thought I'd see if everything's all right. Kind of worried about you. So, I probably creeped you out. Sorry. It's none of my business. But I hope you're doing okay. Hey, so we talked at Strongfish 91's place, but I thought I'd drop a line. It was nice to meet you. Remember, you can PM me whenever you need to talk. I know that feel, bro.
Inserted under this message was a drawing of a hug between two odd-looking froggets. Papyrus assumed they were supposed to be froggets anyway. They didn't look quite right.
At Strongfish 91 says you're sick. I have chicken-flavored ramen if you'd like some. That's kind of like soup. Get well soon.
Crying emoji.
Don't take this the wrong way, but are you really sick? Because sometimes I say I'm sick when I'm just feeling kind of bad and don't want to be around anyone. If you want to talk, I'm right here. You don't have to. If you want a distraction, you know I'm always good for that, lol.
Sweat emoji. Those last two had just come through. So, Sans had called him off sick? That was something of a relief. He still didn't like that Sans had done it in the first place, but the lie made it feel, oddly, a little less like Sans and Undyne ganging up on him, and more like Sans was on his side. Papyrus was pondering how best to respond to Alphys, since it was mean to keep ignoring her when she was only trying to be kind, when he heard the front door open. Normally, that wouldn't be a very noticeable sound from the second floor, but when it was kicked open hard enough to bounce off the wall...
Papyrus!
Undyne,